On the wall doesn't care about your dreams. It doesn't care if you are tired or if you feel like you need just 5 more minutes of sleep. It simply moves. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound is a tiny funeral for a second that will never, ever return. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, his head resting in his hands. The room was dim, lit only by the gray, uncertain light of a Tuesday morning. He could hear the world waking up outside, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, the sound of a neighbor's door closing. These were the sounds of life moving forward, but inside Mark's room, everything felt frozen. Beside him, his smartphone glowed with a persistent, artificial blue light. He had already spent 45 minutes scrolling through news feeds and social media posts. He didn't even remember what he had seen. The images and videos had washed over his brain like meaningless static, leaving him feeling drained before the day had even truly begun. "I'll start tomorrow," he whispered to the empty room. It was a phrase that had become his mantra, a soft lullaby he sang to his conscience whenever it tried to wake him up. Mark was a man of great potential. At least that's what his teachers had said 10 years ago. He had a half-finished manuscript for a novel sitting in a drawer, a set of Spanish-language textbooks covered in a thin layer of dust, and a gym membership card that hadn't been swiped in months. Every morning he promised himself that today would be different. Today he would be the man who conquered his to-do list. But as the hours stretched out before him, the illusion of later began to take hold. Later was a magical land where he was always disciplined, always energetic, and always successful. Later was where his best self lived. But the problem with later is that it is always a day away. He walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under his weight. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he felt a familiar sensation, a heavy, invisible pressure in his chest. It wasn't a physical pain, but a mental one. It was the invisible fog of procrastination. Every time Mark said, "later," the fog grew thicker. It was made of all the things he hadn't done, all the words he hadn't written, and all the promises he had broken to himself. It followed him from room to room, making his movements slow and his mind cloudy. The fog whispered to him. It told him that the task was too big, that the timing wasn't right, and that he deserved a break. So instead of writing that first chapter, Mark sat at his kitchen table and opened his phone again. He told himself he was finding inspiration, but deep down he knew the truth. He was hiding. He was using the digital world to escape the demands of the real one. The day passed in a blur of minor distractions. He checked his email 10 times, though no important messages were expected. He organized his desktop icons. He spent an hour deciding what to have for lunch. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, accusing shadows across his apartment. He had achieved nothing, yet he felt exhausted. This is the paradox of wasting time. It is far more tiring to do nothing than it is to do something meaningful. The weight of the things we avoid is much heavier than the effort required to finish them. As the sun finally disappeared, leaving the city in a blanket of purple and gold, Mark found himself standing by his window. He watched the people below, commuters rushing home, students carrying heavy bags, couples walking hand in hand. They all seemed to have a destination. They all seemed to be moving with purpose. And there he was, standing in the silence of his own inaction. The later he had promised himself that morning had arrived, and it looked exactly like the now he had tried to escape. The house was perfectly still at midnight. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Mark was sitting on the floor of his small home office,
surrounded by boxes he hadn't opened since he moved in 3 years ago. He had been looking for a specific document, but instead, his fingers found something else, an old silver-framed photograph. He wiped the dust away with his thumb. In the photo, a younger version of Mark looked back at him. He was standing on top of a mountain he had climbed during a summer trip in his early 20s. His face was sun-scorched and glowing with a raw, electric joy. His eyes were bright, filled with the fire of a man who believed the entire world was his for the taking. Mark looked at the photo, and then he looked at his reflection in the darkened window of his office. The contrast was devastating. Where had that fire gone? When did the bright-eyed adventurer turn into a man who was afraid of a blank page? A wave of regret hit him with the force of a physical blow. It started in his stomach and rose up to his throat, making it hard to breathe. He began to calculate the time he had lost. Over the last 5 years, how many hours had he spent watching television shows he didn't even like? How many days had he surrendered to the endless scroll of a screen? He realized then that time is the only truly non-renewable resource. You can lose money and earn it back. You can lose your health and sometimes recover it. You can even lose a friend and find a new one. But a minute is a one-way street. Once it passes the finish line, it is gone forever. It is a drop of water falling into a deep, dark ocean. You can never fish it back out. Mark closed his eyes and imagined his life as a giant hourglass. In his mind, he could see the sand falling. Each grain represented a choice, a conversation, a breath. He watched as the top half of the glass grew emptier and emptier. He realized that for years he had been acting as if the sand was infinite, as if he could just flip the glass over whenever he wanted. But life doesn't have a reset button. The regret felt like a cold stone in his heart. He thought of his parents, who were growing older. He thought of the places he wanted to see and the person he wanted to become. He had been treating his life like a dress rehearsal, waiting for the real performance to start. But this was it. This was the play. The curtain had been up for years, and he had been sitting in the wings, waiting for a cue that was never going to come. He felt a deep, aching sadness for the versions of himself that had died because of his hesitation. The novelist who never wrote, the traveler who never left home, the athlete who never trained. They were all ghosts now, haunting the hallways of his mind. He realized that the greatest tragedy in life is not death, but what dies inside us while we are still alive. He looked back at the clock. 12:15. He had spent 15 minutes just thinking about his regret. That was another 15 grains of sand gone. He felt a sudden, sharp desperation. He didn't want to lose another grain. Not one. To change, Mark knew he had to understand the enemy. He sat at his desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote, "Why do I wait?" He began to analyze the anatomy of his own distractions. He realized that his phone was not just a tool, it was a drug. Every notification, every like, every new post triggered a tiny burst of dopamine in his brain. It was a cheap, easy reward. His brain had become addicted to the hit of new information, even if that information was useless. It was much easier to get a dopamine hit from a 30-second video of a cat than it was to get a sense of achievement from writing a difficult scene in a book. Procrastination, he realized, was a sophisticated form of self-protection. He didn't avoid his book because he was lazy. He avoided it because he was terrified. As long as the book was unfinished in his head, it could be a masterpiece. But the moment he put words on paper, they might be bad. They might be mediocre. By not starting, he was protecting himself from the possibility of failure. He was choosing the safety of nothing over the risk of something. He also realized he had fallen into the busy trap. He often spent hours doing low-value tasks, cleaning his apartment, color-coding his calendar, responding to unimportant comments online. At the end of these days, he felt tired, so he told himself he had been productive. But being busy and being productive are two very different things. Running in circles makes you sweat, but it doesn't get you any closer to your destination. Mark looked at the paper. He saw the pattern of his life laid out in his own handwriting. He saw the fear, the addiction to easy rewards, and the excuses he used to hide from his own potential. The invisible fog was still there, but it felt thinner now. He realized that the fog didn't come from the work he had to do, it came from the act of avoiding it. The moment he faced the task, the fog began to lift. He stood up and walked over to his mirror. He looked himself in the eye. His face was tired, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But there was something else there, too, a small, flickering spark. "No more," he said. His voice was quiet, but firm. "No more tomorrows. No more later. No more hiding." He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the dopamine would call to him tomorrow, and the fear would try to convince him to stay in bed. But he also knew that the pain of discipline is much lighter than the pain of regret. Discipline weighs ounces, but regret weighs tons. He went back to his desk. He took his smartphone, turned it off completely, and placed it in a kitchen drawer. He came back, sat down, and opened the manuscript that had been untouched for months. He didn't wait for inspiration. He didn't wait for the right mood. He simply picked up a pen. He made a solemn promise to himself, right there in the middle of the night. He would no longer be a spectator in his own life. He would no longer let his time be stolen by things that didn't matter. He was reclaiming his life, 1 second at a time. The clock ticked again. This time, Mark didn't hear a funeral. He heard a heartbeat. He heard a call to action. And for the first time in years, he began to write. The morning light arrived with a cold, unforgiving clarity. When the sun rose on Wednesday, it didn't find the same Mark who had spent the previous 5 years in a haze. It found a man who had only slept for 4 hours, but whose mind was sharp with a new, dangerous kind of focus. However, as Mark sat up in bed, the midnight motivation he had felt just hours ago had vanished. This is the great trap of the human mind. We make our boldest decisions in the dark of night, but we have to execute them in the cold light of day. The excitement was gone, replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion and a powerful urge to return to his old habits. His hand moved automatically toward the nightstand, searching for his phone. His fingers brushed against the empty wood, and he remembered. The phone was in the kitchen. It was turned off. A wave of anxiety washed over him. It felt like he was missing a limb. His brain began to scream for its morning dose of stimulation. "Just check the weather," a voice inside his head suggested. "What if there was an emergency? What if someone needs you?" Mark took a deep breath. He realized that this was the first battle. The war for his life wasn't going to be won with a single heroic gesture at midnight. It was going to be won in these small, silent moments, when he had to say no to the easy path. He forced himself to stand up. His legs felt heavy, as if he were walking through deep water, but he moved toward the bathroom. Instead of the usual long, steaming shower where he would get lost in daydreams, he turned the handle to the coldest setting. The water hit him like a physical shock, 1,000 tiny needles of ice against his skin. He gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was uncomfortable. It was painful, but it was real. For the first time in years, Mark felt completely awake. He wasn't just existing, he was experiencing the raw, sharp edge of the present moment. As he dried himself off, he noticed something strange. The invisible fog he usually felt in the mornings was slightly thinner. By choosing the difficult path, the cold water instead of the warm, the empty nightstand instead of the glowing screen, he had already begun to burn the fog away. He walked into the kitchen. The coffee machine hissed and bubbled, filling the small room with a rich, earthy aroma. Usually, while the coffee brewed, Mark would lean against the counter and scroll through news apps until his eyes went dry. Today, he simply stood there. He watched the steam rise. He listened to the sound of the rain beginning to tap against the window pane. He was practicing the rarest of modern skills, the ability to do nothing without being distracted. He took his coffee to his desk. The clean sheet of paper from the night before was still there, with his analysis of his own weaknesses. He looked at the Spanish textbooks on the shelf. For months, they had been a source of guilt, a silent reminder of his failure to start. He reached out and pulled the first book down. The weight of the book felt significant in his hands. He opened to the first page. He didn't tell himself he was going to master the language today. He didn't promise to study for 3 hours. He simply set a timer for 10 minutes. This was his new strategy, the 2-minute rule. He had read somewhere that the hardest part of any task is simply starting it. Once you start, the momentum often carries you forward. But if the task feels too big, like learning Spanish or writing a novel, the brain gets overwhelmed and seeks a distraction. So he made the task so small it was impossible to fail. Yo soy Mark, he read aloud. Yo hablo un poco de español. The words felt clumsy in his mouth, like heavy stones he was trying to balance on his tongue. He felt a familiar urge to stop, to find something easier to do. But he looked at the timer. 6 minutes left. He could do 6 minutes. He forced his eyes back to the page. When the timer finally buzzed, a strange thing happened. He didn't want to stop. The friction of starting had been overcome, and now he was in the flow of the work. He reset the timer for another 10 minutes. By the time he closed the book, 40 minutes had passed. He had learned 20 new words and the basics of verb conjugation. He sat back, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. It wasn't a mountain peak. He hadn't conquered a world, but he had conquered himself for 40 minutes. And in the economy of time, that was a massive profit. However, the afternoon brought a new kind of challenge. By 2 o'clock, the initial energy of his new life began to fade. This is where most people fail. They start with a burst of enthusiasm, but when the novelty wears off and the hard work becomes boring, they slide back into the old, comfortable patterns of wasting time. Mark felt the resistance rising within him. It was a term he had discovered in his reading, the internal force that fights against any act of creativity or self-improvement. The resistance is clever. It doesn't tell you to quit forever. It just tells you to quit for today. It tells you that you've done enough, that you're tired, and that you can reward yourself with just one little video. He looked at the kitchen drawer where his phone was hidden. He could feel it calling to him, a digital siren song. He imagined the bright colors, the endless stream of information, the quick hits of laughter and excitement. His apartment felt suddenly quiet and empty. The silence was heavy. The silence is where the work happens, he whispered to himself. He realized that his entire life had been an attempt to escape silence. He used white noise, podcasts, music, and social media to drown out the voice of his own thoughts. But the voice of his thoughts was where his dreams lived. If he kept drowning it out, he would never hear what his life was trying to tell him. He decided to change his environment. He knew that willpower was a limited resource, and if he had to fight the urge to check his phone all day, he would eventually lose. He had to make the right choices easier and the wrong choices harder. He spent the next hour clearing the path. He deleted all the games and social media apps from his phone. He turned off all non-essential notifications. He cleared his desk of everything except his manuscript and a single pen. He even moved his television into the guest closet. He was creating a sanctuary of focus. He understood now that we are products of our environment. If you live in a room full of distractions, you will be distracted. But if you create a space that demands your best self will eventually show up. As evening approached, Mark felt a different kind of tiredness. It wasn't the drained, hollow exhaustion of a day spent scrolling. It was the good tired, the feeling of a muscle that has been used for a purpose. He went back to the window where he had stood the night before. The city was still there, moving at its usual frantic pace. But Mark didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like he was finally standing on the same ground as everyone else. He looked at the clock. 7 o'clock. Usually, this was the time he would order a pizza and watch 3 hours of a reality show he didn't even like.
Instead, he walked to the kitchen and prepared a simple, healthy meal. He ate slowly, without a screen in front of his face. He noticed the texture of the vegetables, the heat of the food, the way the light caught the steam. He was becoming present. He was reclaiming the seconds he used to throw away. But the real test was yet to come. A week passed. The first 3 days had been fueled by the shock of change, but by day 7, the grind had become real. His novel was difficult. The Spanish verbs were confusing. His body ached from the gym. He reached the plateau of latent potential. This is the period where you are working hard, but you don't see any visible results yet. You've written 10,000 words, but the book is still a mess. You've studied Spanish every day, but you still can't hold a conversation. You've gone to the gym 4 times, but you still look the same in the mirror. This is the danger zone. This is where the mind begins to lie to us. It's not working, the resistance whispered. You're wasting your time anyway. Why bother? You'll never be a writer. You'll never be fluent. Go back to the screen. It's safer there. Mark sat at his desk, staring at a sentence he had rewritten 5 times. He felt a deep, dark frustration bubbling up inside him. He wanted to throw the pen across the room. He wanted to give up. He remembered the hourglass. He imagined the sand falling. He realized that the results aren't the point. The process is the point. If he only worked for the reward at the end, he will always be disappointed, because the reward is always in the future. But if he could learn to love the work itself, the struggle of the sentence, the difficulty of the verb, the burn of the muscle, then he would be successful every single day. He thought of the mountain climber in the photograph. That man hadn't just loved the view from the top. He had loved the burn in his lungs and the grit under his fingernails. He had loved the climb. Mark took a deep breath and looked at the messy, imperfect sentence on the page. He didn't try to make it perfect. He just tried to make it true. He realized that not wasting time didn't mean being perfect every second. It meant being engaged every second. It meant showing up, even when you were tired. It meant writing, even when the words were bad. It meant living your life instead of watching someone else live theirs. He picked up the pen. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Mark didn't look at the clock. He didn't wonder how much time he had left. He just focused on the next word. He focused on the next grain of sand. He was no longer afraid of the funeral of his seconds, because he was finally giving them a life worth living. The later he had chased for a decade was gone. There was only now, and for Mark, for the first time in his life, now was enough. Months drifted by, the seasons changing outside Mark's window with a quiet, persistent rhythm. The frost of winter gave way to the pale, budding greens of spring, which eventually deepened into the heavy, golden warmth of summer. Inside Mark's apartment, a similar transformation had taken place.
His physical space was no longer a battlefield of distractions. It had become a workshop. The guest closet was still occupied by the television he hadn't watched in half a year. His smartphone sat in the same kitchen drawer, used only for essential calls. The invisible fog that had once defined his existence had been replaced by a light, steady air of purpose. Mark noticed the changes in himself first in the mirror. His face was no longer puffy and pale from late-night screens and poor sleep. His jawline was sharper, his eyes clear. But the most profound changes were internal. He had developed a rhythm of focus. He no longer needed a Herculean effort to start his work. His morning cold shower and 10 minutes of Spanish had become as natural as breathing. One Saturday afternoon, Mark found himself at a local cafe, sitting by the window with his laptop. He was working on the final chapters of his novel. As he looked up to take a sip of coffee, he saw a familiar face walking through the door. It was Tom, an old friend he hadn't seen in nearly a year. Tom looked exactly the same tired posture, the same restless eyes, the same smartphone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He spotted Mark and hurried over, a wide, easy smile on his face. "Mark, man, it's been ages. You look different. You look great," Tom said, pulling up a chair. They talked for a while about old times, but soon the conversation turned to the present. "So, what are you up to?" Tom asked, gesturing toward Mark's laptop. "Still working on that big project you always talked about?" "I'm actually finishing the first draft today," Mark said quietly. Tom's eyebrows shot up. "No way! That's incredible! I've been meaning to start my own blog, you know. I've got so many ideas. I'm just waiting for things to settle down at work. Probably next month, once the big merger is over, I'll really dive in." Mark listened as Tom spoke, and it felt like he was listening to a recording of his own past. He heard the familiar justifications, the promise of a better time in the future, the subtle lie that external circumstances were the only thing holding him back. He felt a deep surge of empathy for his friend, but also a sharp, clarifying realization. Tom wasn't waiting for a merger to end. He was waiting for life to become easy. But life is never easy. It is always full of mergers and bills and tired mornings and unexpected emergencies. If you wait for the perfect time, you are waiting for a ghost. "You should start today, Tom," his voice gentle. "Just 5 minutes, even just writing the title." Tom laughed and waved his hand dismissively. "Nah, I'm too drained today. I've spent the last 3 hours just catching up on news."
Did you see that story about... Mark watched as Tom pulled out his phone to show him a video. In that moment, the contrast was blinding. Tom was paying for a few seconds of entertainment with a currency he could never earn back. He was trading his potential for a dopamine hit. After they parted ways, Mark sat in silence for a long time. He realized that the greatest debt a person can carry is the debt of inaction. Every time we choose a distraction over a dream, we are taking a loan from our future selves, and the interest rate is devastating. We pay back that loan with regret, with bitterness, and with a life that feels smaller than it was meant to be. He went back to his novel. He wasn't writing for fame or money anymore. He was writing because it was an act of respect for the time he had been given. Each sentence was a way of saying, "I am here. I am awake. I am using this moment." 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening that felt remarkably like the one where his journey had begun, Mark typed the final 3 words of his book, "The End." He sat back, his heart racing. The apartment was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full. He didn't feel the need to shout or celebrate with a post online. He simply closed the laptop and felt the weight of the achievement. It wasn't just a book. It was a physical proof that he had reclaimed his life. He had turned thousands of worthless seconds into something that would exist long after he was gone. He walked to the hallway and stood before the grandfather clock. He watched the pendulum swing back and forth. Tick, tick, tick. He realized now that the clock isn't an enemy, it is a teacher. It teaches us that everything is temporary, our pain, our joy, and our very lives. This transience is what gives time its value. If we lived forever, a minute would be worth nothing. But because our time is limited, every second is a diamond.
Mark went to his kitchen and took the old, silver-framed photograph of his younger self on the mountain. He placed it on his desk, next to his completed manuscript. He looked at the bright-eyed man in the photo and smiled. He realized he didn't need to get back to that mountain to be that man again. He was that man now. The fire hadn't been lost. It had just been buried under the ash of later. He looked out the window at the city lights. Millions of people were down there, many of them caught in the same invisible fog he had escaped. He wished he could tell them all, "Stop waiting, stop hiding. The clock is ticking, but that's not a threat, it's an invitation." We often think that wasting time is a small sin, like a tiny leak in a pipe. We think, it's just 10 minutes, it's just 1 hour. But a leak, if left alone, will eventually empty the entire reservoir. Your life is that reservoir. Don't wait for a moment of clarity like Mark had. Don't wait for the pain of regret to become unbearable. Look at the clock right now. Listen to the sound of your own breathing. This is the only now you will ever have. What will you do with it? Will you bury it under a screen, or will you plant it like a seed? The choice belongs to you. The time, however, belongs to no one. It only passes. Mark turned off the light in his office. He didn't feel the urge to check his phone. He didn't feel the need to plan a perfect tomorrow. He simply walked to his bed, lay down, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. He knew that when the sun rose, he would be ready, not because he was perfect, but because he was finally, truly awake. The clock on the wall continued to move. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was no longer a funeral. It was a promise. It was the sound of a life being lived, one precious second at a time. Don't waste your time. It is the only thing you truly have, and it is more than enough to change your world.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.